I guess we'll get started. I'm delighted today to be able to introduce David Bishop as our guest speaker. So he's given this talk pretty much every year when I'm offering this course, and it's always very popular. It turns out that a lot of the techniques that we're teaching you guys actually are useful in the real world. And one of the great things about David's talk is he has all these examples of cases where HCI principles have dramatically improved products. And David also helps around CMU with a variety of other activities. He's an adjunct professor in our master's course, and this spring and summer he will be helping with a whole bunch of projects with them as well. And so I've taught with David as well as having him work with this class, and he's really useful to have around in terms of his actual knowledge of how industry really works. And also, if you have a local company and you want help with your user interfaces, then I would certainly recommend you hire this company.
You don't even have to be local. So thanks. So my name's Dave Bishop. I am the Chief Human Scientist at Maya Design. We are downtown in this building. It's 4 Gateway Center. We're on the 16th floor. We have pretty much the whole 16th floor down there. Maya's been around for about 25 years. This is a pitch that we often give to our prospects to explain to them why we exist. You can probably figure some of this out on your own. But what I'll do is I'll talk a little bit about Maya, what it's like to be at a consultancy, some of the techniques we use. And don't hesitate to stop me and ask for some of the details. But I also have in here a bunch of case studies of Maya's work so that I can show you how we use a lot of the stuff in practice. So we point out to people that the cost of power and complexity has come down. Depending on who you ask and exactly where you get the statistics from, we make more microprocessors. Sometimes it's transistors, but probably make more microprocessors now than grains of rice on this planet, and we do it cheaper. Back in the 1900s, if you were in Pittsburgh, the only place you could really get books was to go to the Carnegie libraries. Books were really for the elite, not everyone owned them, and as you can imagine now, it's pretty easy. Well, of course, we have many more libraries, but now we can go buy books online. We have Project Gutenberg. You can get a Kindle and buy books sometimes for 99 cents, and this is all delivered to you wirelessly through fairly ubiquitous network. So this cost of stuff has come down. But you can imagine there's another side to that, and that's that there's this trend of the information increasing. And again, depending on who you talk to and how much they want to impress you with this in any given day, we create 2 Library of Congresses of information every day. Or it's Facebook that creates 2 libraries of Congresses of information every day. Or it's a Library of Congress worth of structured information per day or something like that. But the point is, the amount of information we're generating and creating is huge. And so you're left with this, this gap because humans aren't really evolving, right? My brain power, my ability to remember is probably the same as my father's and his grandfather's and his grandfather's grandfather's and so on. Certainly not at the pace of these other things that are going on, right? So we say that we are in the business of taming complexity. It's this idea that the power of these systems, the possibility for creating complexity, the amount of information that's in the world has skyrocketed, and our ability to figure it out, to work within this realm, to do anything useful with it, and so on, is largely about the same as it was in the 1900s or so. So, and one of the reasons we say taming complexity is because our job is not to take a complex product and turn it into a non-complex product. And we'd have all these things that are basically just like hammers. They only do one thing. Our job is to tame this complexity somehow, and we'll show you how we do this. But that's taking products that have feature creep, have usability problems, have complexity problems, have problems because they live in a complex data space, and try to tame some of that complexity. One of the tenets of good human-centered design practice is that you want to do things in an interdisciplinary way. And Maya has basically been built from the ground up. The 3 founders were a computer scientist, a cognitive psychologist, so basically a human scientist, and a designer. He was an industrial designer, but we had someone from each of these realms. And even today, we're still built up out of these disciplines. So the engineering people know how things work. It's not just, it says computer science, et cetera, but it's not just computer science, but it's how do you build things, how do you make databases, how do you move things through networks, art of what in the world is possible. The human scientists know how people think. So we've got anthropology and ethnography and usability experts, fields like cognitive psychology, that's those people here, all working together with visual designers, industrial designers, and folks that are in the domain of giving things form and function. And Maya works at the center here, and we put a lot of effort into making sure that everything we do in the company is done in an interdisciplinary way. So when you go to Maya, you can't find these three disciplines. They're spread throughout our entire organization. So any given neighborhood of people you find has some people from each of these disciplines. Brad had asked me to talk a little bit about information architecture, and I want to show you this slide and sort of set it up for you. But then when we talk about some of the case studies, I'll tell you why Maya talks a lot about information architecture, why we think it's important, why we think it's important to drive good user interface design. So over here is the guts of some system, right? This is the databases or the networks, or maybe it's a physical system and it's actually the gears as we represented here. But this is the sort of more pure engineering part, the system architecture. And it's a very important part of the system. You wouldn't have anything that worked if you didn't have the engineers or you didn't have the expertise to actually build something. At this end is all the part that faces the users, the end users. Right? Someone's going to have to interact with this. And I've heard a zillion terms. We call this the user interface, the UI. We call the domain often user experience. I've also heard it called HMI, the human machine interface. You see this a lot when someone's building a physical product. So it's a valve or something that goes out in the field, and they say, well, it's going to have a control panel on it, and they call that the HMI. So I don't really care so much about the terminology, but the point is that this is the part here that faces the user. This is the part here that the user really never sees, but you wouldn't have the product if that wasn't built. And in here is this middle realm that a lot of people don't often think of, yet it's very important, and that's this notion of information architecture. So if you think about Amazon, for example, all of this is all the back end, right? This is how in the world we send all this information around the world. How do we do it with content delivery networks? How do we do it fast? How do we store databases of books and reviews and all the stuff about how you make the shopping carts work and payments happen and all that kind of stuff is all back here on the back end. And it's great and it's important, and the databases have to have some organizational structures to them, and a lot of it has to do with speed and robustness and so on. And over here in the user interface, obviously that has to work well, because if people can't find the books and the movies and the things they're trying to buy or rent or move to their Kindle or whatever it is they're trying to do, or return or put stuff into their wish lists or their bridal registry, whatever it was, then Amazon won't make money, right? They have to streamline everything that's over here. But how do they do it? If you think about Amazon, someone had to sit down and figure a way to store, and I don't mean in the databases, I mean sort of how is this organized. You have to be able to realize that there are books, and the books are written by authors, so that once I go to Moby Dick, I can click on Herman Melville and realize that Herman Melville has written many books. But it's deeper than that, because they've got to tame the complexity of this world where books have editions. So someone's got to sit down and say, okay, there's multiple editions of this book, right? Someone wrote the book, and then 10 years later they updated it and they called it the second edition. And then 10 years after that they updated it again and called it the third edition. If someone reviews a book, does the review go to the book or does it go to the edition, right? Someone had to think of that and figure it out. And you got to tell these guys over here, the engineers, which way you want it to work. Right? Did I review the book or an edition of the book? So that when I go to the third edition, do they automatically all vanish? There's no reviews of this. Right? Why? Because, well, I put them on the edition. On the other hand, if I put them all on the book, right, then I might be looking at a review, and the review is for the first edition, and it says it's terrible, and the book has actually improved, and I'm looking at the third edition, and I don't buy it, but it's the review that's actually very old. So those are the kind of things you have to think about. And you can imagine how that's going to affect the user interface, right? Because now I have to be able to expose to people, well, which is it? And I've got to figure out the complexity. I've got to decide how I'm going to do it. Another thing, just to stay on the Amazon example, if someone reviews a book, are they reviewing the content of the book, like, oh, Moby Dick, what a terrible story. Everybody dies in the end, including the whale. Or are they saying, oh, Moby Dick, what a terrible book. The binding smelled like glue, right? Well, geez, now I realize that they come in paperback, it comes in hardback, it comes in an audio book, and you got to figure that stuff out too, right? So the engineers over here, they're going to do it one way or another. They're going to like put those reviews somewhere in the database and point them at an edition or the book or the binding or something like that. You're going to have to expose it to the users somehow. But honestly, this in here is where you're going to think about it, right? And once you get some of that structure right, it really helps you figure out how you're going to design your UI, and it helps you talk to the engineers about how they're going to implement the thing. So in a lot of cases, this is what's really important. One of the places this shows up, and I don't want to talk, I mean, I could talk about this for 9 hours. But think about, this is where you see it a lot. Think about searching on websites. If you go to a website and the search is kind of terrible and crappy and you can't really find what you want, probably what it means is they have a whole database of all the things, products, books, reviews, articles, whatever it is. You type in a search term, and they basically look at everything and say, give me back everything in the database that has that search term in it. And then you think, okay, well, that might be a lot of stuff. How do I present it to people? Well, the obvious thing to do is just to look at the ratio that the search term appears to in that document. Because if it appears a lot, then it's probably really relevant to that search term. I'll put it up at the top. Well, it also happens if the document is short, it'll go up to the top too. And it doesn't really help you drill down and find it any better. Now, think on the other hand about your experience at Land's End. At Land's End, you can go in and you can just type in pajamas. And what it thinks, you know, somewhere back in here between the information architecture and the system architecture, but someone was smart enough to say, you know what, we sell a lot of stuff at Land's End. And every one of our products has a lot of different qualities. Like some of them are for men and some are for women. Some are for children and some aren't. Some have sizes and some are one size fits all. Some are made out of cotton and some aren't. Some are for this season, some are for that season, right? Some you wear on the top half of your body, some you wear on the bottom half of your body. And so what Land's End is able to do when you type in pajamas is realize that's a really vague search term, but boy, do they want to sell you a pair of pajamas, because they think you want to buy a pair of pajamas, you think you want to buy a pair of pajamas, and they need to kind of walk you through figuring out how to winnow this and narrow this. So what they say is, pajamas, we have 1 million pajamas, right? You should try this and look at how they've done it. Because now it's going to say, oh, did you mean for men, for women, or for children? Right? Because it realizes basically someone thought about the information architecture, and rather than just burping up the pajamas, you know, or they say, do you want to see just the ones that are on sale, or do you want to see the ones that are cotton? Right? What size pajamas were you looking for? Right? What season maybe were you looking for? And they can figure this kind of stuff out, right? They can also do things like figure out where you are in the country and realize if you're farther south, you probably don't need the flannel pajamas. And if you're farther up north, that's probably all you ever want to see. But the point is, this is the sort of thinking about the information space that someone had to do so that you can get the databases right or the back ends right. And it's also so that over here, you can make the user interface make a lot of sense. Rather than just burping up, oh yeah, we have 10,000, who knows how many kinds they have, 10,000 different kinds of pajamas. I have a slide here that talks a little bit about some of the clients we work for, but suffice it to say that there are lots of different clients in lots of different industries, and I think that from my standpoint, working in a consulting organization, this is one of the things that's probably most wonderful and most fun, is that we work in all these different domains. So we'll have Target call us and ask us to work on personas based on some research and no user interface design work. And then later we'll have Dun & Bradstreet call us and say, no, we know exactly who the users are. We want you guys to help us build a next generation website for looking up companies and finding out whether they pay or not. And so to me, it's not for everybody maybe, but this variety really makes it interesting to go to work every day. But also, it allows us to take something we learn from here and take it to this guy, and something we learn from there and take it to the other guy. And that's something that they don't often do. A lot of these companies, they're in their little domain. They probably know what their competitors are doing, but they're really terrible at reaching into another domain and saying, well, how is this done at Walt Disney? Or how is this done at Harley Davidson? Or how is this done at banks, even though we're not a bank, right? Or we are a bank. How does, you know, and I'm looking for various credit cards. Well, how does Land's End help me find pajamas? Would that be relevant when I'm at a bank trying to find and figure out which credit card's right for me amongst a whole bunch? Well, it turns out in a lot of cases it is, and that's probably sometimes our superpower as a consultant, is that we're able to bring things in from some of these other domains. You're welcome to come visit Maya. But this is a little dark, but we've specifically designed our space, as I said before, to do interdisciplinary design, to collaborate all the time, to try to get our clients to come in and work with us and write alongside on the whiteboards with us. It does not look like a cube farm. It's very intentional. I think this helps you, of course, as you're a consultant. We do a lot of work where the work gets placed up on the walls. We keep buying digital cameras and taking more and more and more pictures of it. A lot of this stuff is done in very physical form, right? Yes, we probably have a pretty big Post-it note budget. But again, the point here really isn't it's this technology that's better than that technology. It's important to think about the problems in a good way. And that's what we're about much more than caring whether you use this back-end engine for your database or that one. So think about this for a minute. This is one of our definitions of design. And one of the things we're constantly trying to do with our commercial clients is, I was going to say convince them to do things our way, but it's not exactly it. We're trying to get them to follow good human-centered design principles and follow good design principles. And often they don't necessarily know what they are. In a way that's good for us because it's job security if you're going to work in a consultancy. In another way, though, it's good for us because it forces us to think all the time about what good practice is and try to bake this into our projects, which we'll see as we get to some of the case studies. But this is neat. If you think about it, it's a very simple sentence, but you've got sort of an origin, which is your identified problem. And yes, a lot of the challenge is identifying it correctly and making sure you're solving the right problem, and we call it problem framing. And trying to get to a solution, that's this other one, conceive and form the solution. But design is this journey. It's from the moment, and probably including the problem framing part, and then trying to get ourselves over this journey to some kind of a solution. And this is an important thing that we see people forget lots of times. They think that design is kind of a, well, I did design. Or worse, with human-centered design, they say, well, I brought the usability people in and they designed it. Well, no. But if that's what you're saying, then it probably isn't going to be usable. It's much more of a continuous thing. It's much more of a journey. It's much more of an iterative process, and we'll talk a little bit more about that too. But Heather Fraser at the Rotman School said, it's more like a fitness program. It's more like diet and exercise. It's more like something you have to do all the time. It's not this one-shot kind of a thing. So if anybody ever tells you, oh yes, we did the design, well, I think you should ask them some more questions because they probably didn't, just from that one statement. One of the things that Maya did, and this is hopefully going to tie this back to some of the course you have here, we ended up spinning off a company called the Luma Institute because in a lot of these companies, in a lot of these industries, they also want, in addition to being able to go to a consultancy like Maya and saying, can you just do this work for us, or can you do the research, or can you write the personas, can you help us with the interface design? But they also want to elevate their own game and learn about design and learn about, in particular, human-centered design. But I didn't put that slide up to say we built this other company that does training. But I wanted to show you how we've organized some of the techniques and some of the techniques that we use. So in this first column are all the ones that have to do with observing humans and the user experience and human behavior. So we've got ethnographic research and participatory research and evaluative research. And in the second column, it's all of this stuff about analyzing challenges and opportunities, analyzing problem spaces. All the problem framing stuff is in here. And you'll see some of these examples in some of our work. And then the last is all about, I was talking about iterative design, but this is where all of the prototyping and mock-ups and making storyboards and making concept posters lives over here too. Right? So there's a lot of slides in here, so I'll go a little quickly or we'll never get past this one. But and you can see there's sort of three pieces of this, right? There's the ethnographic research, the participatory research, and the evaluative research. It's not really all that critical that you say, oh, well, on my project I need one of these and two of those, and you have to select it from a menu. But it does kind of help get your head around it a little bit to realize there's sort of different flavors of all this stuff that falls under looking. So in the ethnographic research realm, we do a lot of interviewing. We can do fly-on-the-wall observation. Walk a Mile Immersion. This was me dressed as, well, not dressed as a soldier, but wearing a soldier. This is not my Halloween costume. I'm wearing the soldier's gear so that I can understand what it's like to wear that flak jacket, to have the helmet on. They have a monocle. In this case, it was a monocle. So, what's it like to lose your depth perception when you use this kind of thing? You guys are familiar with the term contextual inquiry. Probably have performed some yourselves. So this is some of that. We use all these techniques, and the challenge is, how do I know on any given project which one is the right one to use, which one is going to be the most cost-effective, which one's going to work time-wise, which one can I actually recruit for? Right? If I can't recruit for contextual inquiry and go and job shadow people and do that kind of work, maybe I'm going to have to do fly-on-the-wall observation. Right? So it kind of depends on what the environment is and how I'm going to get to some of these folks. If you look at the participatory design, there's stuff like this what's on your radar exercise. Has anybody heard of this buy a feature technique? Right? So I found a book a while ago called Innovation Games by a guy named Luke Homan. And he's got a whole bunch of games in there that are serious games. You play them with the potential users of a system. And in this buy a feature, it's a way of getting people to tell you without just asking them, hey, what features would you like? Because you can imagine that's kind of a terrible way to do it. But what I do is I invent a whole bunch of features, too many really, and then I give them all a different cost based on how hard it is I think to implement these things, how hard I think it is to implement these things. And then we can do a design exercise where I have them essentially buy them from me, and I intentionally underfund them. They can't buy them all. Right? So they've got to make some really hard choices about which features they might want and which features they don't want. And Homan has this pretty well described in his book. But all of these things follow that kind of paradigm where I do some setup work, and then I work with the actual users to sort of co-design with them. But it's not really like I'm asking them to make my designs. I'm getting information from them through things like playing games. Yeah?
It's interesting that you do it from a cost perspective. Because I've heard of the $100 game where you give a user $100 and then let them choose the amount that they feel equates to the value that they're getting for that.
Yeah.
So just the flip side of that.
Yeah, and we've also done it in the space way. So you can basically give them several information visualizations and a dashboard, but only a certain number are going to fit, and so they've got to leave some off. And so really what it is, it's this sort of forced decision making within constraints, right? The point is, if you don't do it that way, and I think your way, the method you were just talking about works as well too. If you ask people about features, everyone is going to say they want every feature. And now you have feature creep, and now people can't find anything, and now you have complexity, and you have to figure out how to tame it. And so this is one of these techniques here. And then there's evaluative research like A/B testing, usability testing, heuristic reviews, and so on. And we pretty much everything that's up here, I can't say we use everything on every project, but if you were to walk down to Maya at any given point in time where we've got 9 client projects going on and there's 35 of us, we're probably using one of these techniques at any given point in time. These are kind of our top 32 or 36 or however many fit on those things. So in terms of these understanding methods, there's a lot of stuff about synthesizing knowledge. So we'll map stakeholders, we'll draw experience diagrams, we make concept maps, we build personas all the time. We'll use affinity diagrams. And has anybody heard this technique called visualize the vote? So often, if a lot of our clients asked us to come in and facilitate some kind of a meeting or a brainstorming discussion, and lots of times we'll have concepts that are coming out of that. And the question becomes, how do we evaluate them? There's a very quick way that we'll often use right in that meeting, and we try to make things as democratic as possible. So we'll give everyone a couple little torn up Post-it notes or a couple of those tape flags you're supposed to use, like the sign here flags you see on legal documents, and we'll say, okay, everybody has 3 of these, and there's 10 concepts up on the board. Look at them for a while. You've all seen the presentations for them, and when we say go put your 3 votes on 1 if you want to, or spread it across 3 of these concepts. And it's a quick way to kind of get the feel in a room. Lots of times, if you're working with companies that have a hierarchy, and most do, once the boss says, well, I think number 3 is the best idea, everyone else jumps on and says, of course, boss, it's number 3. That's a bit of an exaggeration, but a lot of these techniques that we use are to try to democratize some of these processes and get more people involved. I don't know if I have one here. No. This one is probably one of the highest value techniques that we have, called Rosebud Thorn. And we stole it from the Boy Scouts. But the point is, if you ask people for critiques of systems and you just have them speak out loud, There's a lot of stuff that happens, and it's probably all terrible. So I'll give an example of a number of soldiers had used a system for the course of a couple days, and then someone said, we would like to have an after-action review. So let's get all these soldiers into a room, and then we're going to ask the soldiers what they liked and what they didn't like about the system. And the first time they did it, it was terrible, meaning the meeting itself was terrible. One of the things that happened was one of the soldiers said, well, you know what really stunk was, right around the middle of the second day, I tried to do X, Y, Z, and I got zapped. And that was terrible. And another guy, and then the thing shut down and went black. And another guy said, yeah, that happened to me too. Yeah, that happened to me too. Oh, that was really terrible, right? And so a couple things happen here. First of all, we don't really know how often that happened. Yeah, it probably was terrible. But you have a whole bunch of like me too, that happened to me, and so on. And they're focusing on one issue. Now, it may very well be that that's the only bad issue and everything else that happened was wonderful. Well, that would be nice to know. It might be there was lots of other bad stuff that happened, but the fact that everyone kind of jumped on that one and piled on that one right away means I never get to find out about any of the other issues. And so what we do with Rosebud Thorn does a couple things. We'll take that same group of people, bring them in a room at the end and say, we're going to do an after-action review, but we're going to do it a little differently. We aren't going to have everyone just speak up. All right? The other thing that happens, by the way, with that is that there's a lot of people that'll just sit back and wait for everyone else to talk. So I don't get feedback from half the people that were involved. Well, why did I have them involved if I'm not going to collect their feedback? So what we'll do with the Rosebud Thorn is we'll say, I'm going to give everyone a stack of Post-its. And on all the red Post-its, we'll call them roses. And I want you to write down all of the things that were good that you can think of. And you've got 20 minutes to go do this over the past couple days of using the system. And on the blue Post-its, I want you to write down all the thorns, all the things that were bad that happened to you, right? And so they'll write down that the screen went blank, or it shut down, or it did this, or did that, whatever it is. And you have 20 minutes to do all this. And I also want you to think about things where they maybe weren't good, so they're not going to call it a rose. They weren't bad, we're not going to call it a thorn. We'll call it a bud. It has the potential to be something good. It's on the road to being something good. Or maybe it's in between, and you can't decide whether it's good or bad, but you think it's notable, and we should have it written down. Everybody can work in silence then, right? In about 20 minutes, if you've got 20 people, you'll get 400 roses, buds, and thorns, right? Which is way more than you're going to get if you just have an after-action review and say, what did you think? And then they say one bad thing, and boom, everybody piles on the dog pile of this one issue, and it becomes this whole big conversation about why it happened, and how it happened, and when it happened to me, and how big a deal it is, and so on. And it's masking all of this other stuff, and I don't get contribution from half the people in the room. And as you can imagine, once I've got 400 of these, I need another technique like affinity diagramming, which I think you guys are familiar with. But the point is, it democratizes it. It gets everyone to participate. I hear good stuff and bad stuff. I hear a lot more bad stuff than if I just did it verbally. So there's a lot of reasons. And the fascinating thing about this is I just changed it a little bit. I changed the exercise slightly. I had people work individually for a while, and then I drove my discussions from that. Because now I can ask people, is there anyone you want to share with the room? Anybody want to share one? Anybody have any more like that one? Does anyone have one that's different from that? And now I sort of stop the dog pile problem. And then finally over here in this ideation, we do a lot of sketching. We do alternative worlds exercises. I was giving you examples before. How would Disney do it? We build storyboards. We build prototypes. I've quit calling things prototypes. I typically call them mock-ups. And one of the reasons is because I don't want my user interface mock-ups to be confused with engineering prototypes. So I let the engineers have that prototypes word, where they really are probably going to build the back end or some databases or some infrastructure, and they're really going to engineer something. And I kind of keep the word mock-up for myself. Things like appearance models, which is really just another kind of mock-up. We build concept posters and video sketches. This is a way of sort of traveling into the future and trying to envision some concepts. You can, in fact, here's an example here where we mock up a magazine article. You say, well, what's the advertisement going to look like when this product is done? Right? A lot of people have trouble thinking of when it's done, and a lot of people have trouble thinking of a product or something we're making other than the sum of all of its features. But forcing someone to come up with a single page advertisement means I have to come up with a hero shot of it. I need to give it a name. I need to give it a tagline. I need to have like 3 or so bullets that talk about the benefits of the thing. And that's really the crux of the product. If you want to talk, have you guys heard the term MVP, minimum viable product, right? Try to write the magazine article or try to write the front page advertisement like this one, right? and I'll show you some home heartbeat stuff later, or try to write the brochure ahead of time, right? Travel out into the future and try to do that. And it's going to force you to write down what the crux of the product is and get everybody on the same page. And that's what all of these techniques in here are designed to do. So let me give you an example of a case study here. So Comcast called us, and they didn't want us to do design work necessarily, or design work as part of that project. So here's an example where someone asked Maya as a consultancy just to do part of this project. We know that we're going to use these personas to drive later design work, or to drive marketing, maybe. So we talked to, I don't know if it says here, probably 50 to 100 interviews. It depends on how big these projects are, how many we're going to do. We take copious notes. We mix both open-ended and targeted questions. We figure out ways to do affinity diagrams and organize the information later. I don't remember what the color codes were for this one in particular, but I just, it's nice to be able to see how much structured data comes out of these things. We do things like affinity diagram to try to understand some of the larger concepts that are coming out of this. And the nice thing about affinity diagrams is that it lets you organize things when you don't know what the structure is ahead of time. So we don't necessarily know what's going to come out of some of this research, or I don't necessarily know what kind of issues I'm going to find in my heuristic analysis or my usability audit or my usability test. But I can use affinity diagrams to let that kind of structure emerge. And so that's the best use of that technique there. Here are some of the early personas that we built, giving them sort of single first names. There's a little bit of detail underneath there on the blue Post-it about how old we think they are. We're bringing in data from some of the real interviews to start doing this. We have these kind of physical boards that we've set up. One of the things we don't want to do is try to overwhelm ourselves with information. So, this kind of fits 15 Post-its or so I don't get to put them all on there, but it also forces me to focus my attention a little bit, which lets us take this a little bit farther. So the reason we might do this, anybody want to take a guess and tell me why I made 5 personas here that look like they're all in the same template? Why would I do that? I mean, of course I need to document them, but why would I lay them out like this on a piece of paper and say, here's the 5 personas I have so far? Yep. Yeah, so I can compare them against each other, right? And I can look at 2 things here. One is, this guy's interesting. He only watches TV 10% of the time, right? So that's an interesting person to have as a persona there. Hopefully we really met a lot of people like Michelle, but that's very different from someone over here that spends 65% of their time watching television. So I want to make sure I have coverage. And that's another thing I do, is make sure I have sort of representation of all the people I talk to, right? Hey, we talk to a lot of people that basically have cut the cord and they don't watch any television. Is that represented in my personas, right? Hey, we talk to a lot of people who are older, a lot of people who are younger. Do I have all the age ranges across here, right? Do I have all of my other demographic profiles represented? And then we can go into a little bit more detail, and I think these have a front and a back, right? So here's sort of the front side of the Dana persona. It doesn't say a whole lot more than the other one did. In fact, it actually says less, but it's got a couple sort of 5 goals here. We've got a representative picture of Dana so that we can remember who she is, right? I can tell that she's got children. I can't tell yet whether she's a single mom or how big the family is. And then I have a lot of details in here that are on the backside, right? So here's that screen time. I can see what sites she might go. We often make these dyadic maps to say, well, there's kind of, in all our research, there's sort of 2 sides of this fence you could be on. And Dana's way over here in the personal content discovery side. Versus, and I hope that I don't have the other personas with me, but if I went and looked at some of the other personas, it's as contrasted with someone else who's a very curated kind of watcher, right? They watch what's being offered, right? They pick their favorite channel, and then what comes from that channel is supposed to be curated from them, versus somebody over here who has a very personalized experience. But this has a lot more detail. The other thing you can see up in here, Dana, she's very, not special, but she's different from the other folks. And here I can see, is this everybody I talk to? Does everybody sort of fall along some of these lines? And I can see Dana's different from sort of the center of mass here. Much, much more mobile access. And at the top, she sort of watches the TV at the airtime, right? So she's not one of the bottom on their schedule. That's very much of a like the TiVo kind of, DVR sort of person. Okay, so that was one case study. Let me jump back a little bit and talk about one of the things we're trying to help our clients with often, and one of the things we're thinking about all the time when we're doing these projects. I showed you that big sort of toolbox from the human-centered design course that we're teaching, and showing you that is like dumping every technique that Maya has out onto the table and saying, we use contextual inquiry, we use, the buy a feature thing, we use visualize the vote, we use rosebud thorn, we do contextual inquiry, we do fly on the wall observation. Well, on every project, I don't use all of those. How can I tell if it's a good project? I don't just count the tools used. Right? Oh, hey, because then I could just add more. Oh, you did contextual inquiry? You should do a usability test also. You should do fly on the wall observation. You should also, stick a heuristic analysis in there. So, if I think about my toolbox at home, the mark of a good job is that, that I've refinished that chair. The mark is not, did I use every tool in my toolbox? So you want to know when is the right time to use which tools, when is the wrong time to use the tools. Is this a good project? Is it not a good project? Specifically along the dimensions of human-centered design and usability. So we tried to develop this thing called the usability maturity model, where we could go and evaluate these projects. And it turns out that kind of scared people, a little too highfalutin, maturity model. We tried to call them process quality assessments. Again, way too many big words, way too many syllables. Checkups, how about checkups, right? And that works, right? No one's really afraid that much of a checkup, and it sounds like I might have a little bit of a coaching opportunity. Let me do a project checkup, and then I can help you, which is what this is intended to do a better job of following some of the good human-centered design models that we know about. Turns out, now this number is changing, I think. There are ISO standards for this. And I didn't know this until I started in this career. The human-centered design processes for interactive systems. Anybody want to take a guess at what's in here? I probably hinted at some of these already. If you think about all the techniques you've learned, and you were going to go put a project plan together, right? What might be in that project plan? What kind of characteristics would be in that project plan? Do I need, yeah, go ahead. You can take a guess. Well, so that may be one of the questions, right? Does my project plan have a good definition of what the end is? Have I framed the problem correctly, right? What about user research? Do you think I should or shouldn't have user research involved in my project plan? Yes, right? What about my makeup of my project team? Who needs to be on my project team? Do I need to have it like the right size, too big, too small? What about the right, go ahead, what's that? The right types of people, the right disciplines, right? So there's another one. And what about the nature of the project, right? Should it be like this big hierarchical thing where I have like one project manager at the top and they tell everybody else what to do? Or should it be, look, I'm going to tell you what the specification is, and I want all you guys that are working on this thing just shut up and build the thing I told you to build over here? I'm kind of giving you the wrong answer, right? No, I probably want it to be much more iterative, right? I want to maybe figure out what my MVP is going to be. And then I might want to try to mock up that MVP. And then I want to get some feedback. And then I want to feed that feedback back in again, right? If you have an existing product, maybe I sort of sneak up on it. I start and I do a heuristic analysis. And then from that, I feed that back in. I make some design changes. And then I test them in my usability lab or something like that. So here's the stuff, and it's in that standard, that every good human-centered design project should have. And it's really 3 simple things. In fact, they're so simple I can draw a little picture of it. I should involve the users, right? And not just involve them, but involve them in every part of my design process. And I should make sure I've involved them all, right? When I'm doing my personas, have I talked to everybody? Have I involved a good cross-section? Is this representative? And not just did I involve them at the beginning and have them be interviewed in order for me to build personas, but I need to involve them in the middle too and make user interface mock-ups and put the things in front of them. And I need to have them involved towards the end of the project too. So, have I involved as many users as I can across all relevant roles and levels of experience across the entire project, right? Am I iterating my design, right? Did I build some mock-ups early? Am I making an MVP and then building and building and building and working through an iterative fashion to get to a better product, right? This is the antithesis of what I said when I was standing over there. Do I just write a spec and then build to the spec? And then finally, am I using, first of all, the right disciplines, as you pointed out, in the second row there, and also, am I doing interdisciplinary design, right? It doesn't help me to have people walled off in different silos and never talk to each other. I want to do it in an interdisciplinary way. Right? So let's skip that one. I talked about that one. We thought for a little while that we could use this, because this is neat. Look, it's the process assessment. Well, we'll just go read this, and it tells us how to do it. And it turns out that even in this document, it says it's really rigorous, it's really involved, it's really formal. It says the assessment approach described above is intended to give reproducible results, and this degree of rigor and the associated formality are not appropriate, which is kind of crazy for a document to tell you not to use it, I thought. I think what they're saying is it's fine in certain instances. But remember, we're trying to do checkups. We're trying to understand this human-centered design process. And we're trying to make it so that I can take a look, maybe even at a proposal that I've written before it even goes to the client, and evaluate it and say, oh, right, I forgot a simple thing. Right? I didn't do it as interdisciplinary as I might. Let me rewrite that proposal a little bit. Well, if this is the case and it's very rigorous and formal, I probably won't get there. What we did was challenged ourselves to come up with a 10-question questionnaire. And it's a little hard to see, I'm sure, from where you guys are, but we can do an evaluation pretty quickly on projects here. And the important thing isn't here whether I can do it or not, but I want to tell you what some of these questions are, because answered in the affirmative, these are good human-centered design practice. So the first one is involve users. And the sub-question says, I don't know if I can even read it on my screen here. Right? But have I involved users at all levels of experience across the entire design, at all levels of training and experience across the entire project? Right? The next one says characterize goals. And you notice that in that persona, when we had Dana up there, we had a couple of her goals listed. So that's the next question is, okay, you told me who the users were, or sorry, you've involved the users, but did I involve them in a way that I know what their goals are? Can I tell you how the users are going to act? Do I understand them well enough that I can really build an interactive system for them? And the next one's very similar. It says model work. Do I know, maybe if it's Amazon, do I know how people find books and get them into the shopping cart and check out? If it's a back-end system for a healthcare company, do I know how these people enter the names of the folks that are supposed to be on this healthcare plan? So have I modeled their work in a way that I can actually make it more usable and make it work better for them? This one says develop mock-ups. Right? Have you made mock-ups throughout the length of the project? And have you used those mock-ups to go and test the user interface or the user experience that you're building? This one says define metrics. So I made the mock-ups. I did put them in front of users. But am I getting feedback so that I know it is getting more usable? Do I have metrics? Do you know that you can measure things? I can measure how long it takes people to do the tasks. I can measure whether they make errors. I can measure for everybody that put the stuff in the shopping cart, were they all able to get a credit card number in there and actually purchase those things? Did they ship them to the right address? So did they do things error-free? Did they do them with not necessarily the smallest, but few and an appropriate number of clicks? This one says test for usability, right? So I talked about this one when we're talking about making prototypes is about did you make them at all? But this is more about what I did with them, right? Did I put them in front of users? Did I do heuristic analyses on them? Did I do cognitive walkthroughs? There's a lot of different ways I can test my mock-ups, but hopefully I'm putting them in front of representative users, if not actual users. This one says design improvements. So all that is great, and you should do all of that. But if you don't actually go and change your design based on all that feedback, you're not moving forward. So this is the part that we're checking to see if you're doing iterative design. And finally, this asks about whether you have an interdisciplinary team. Do you have a number of different roles on your project? And have you designed your project team so that they're really all working together and helping each other and not in silos? So does this make some sense? Right? The nice thing about this is that I thought I had one that was filled out. But sometimes we can look at a team then and say, okay, I looked at your project or I looked at the team, and I'm going to give you a 1 to 5 rating on each of these things, right? A couple of us will interview a team and they'll say, yeah, we did. We went out and we did this field study and we did that contextual inquiry, did something else, we ran a usability test, and I go, wow, it really seems like you guys are exemplary in terms of involving the users, right? And I say, do you know what it is that the users are trying to do? And they tell me, and they show me the personas, and they show that they understand what the user's goals are and so on. We get down to here and I say, what are you measuring in terms of usability? And they say, oh, we have no idea. Right? Or we didn't know we could measure stuff. Or we have a satisfaction survey, And I say, yeah, but are you measuring how long it takes them to do the tasks? Or are you measuring whether everyone is successful or not? And they go, no. Okay, well, so now I can draw this little picture here, and anytime you have a big dent like that, I can say you have a lot of room for improvement. Or I can look at multiple projects and say, you know, those guys on the top should probably talk to this project team, because these guys more or less have it all together. And now I can say, you know, here's somebody you should emulate. Go find, especially if you guys are all in the same company, right? Go find their project planner, go find their project manager, or go find someone on that team. I'll just skip ahead. So for one of our clients, we evaluated 40 or so of their projects. And so it was interesting to me to say, okay, across all 40 projects, are there a couple places, this is a little bit, you guys know where, you've heard of heuristic analysis, and you used Nielsen and Molik's heuristics probably, or some set of those, right? So you know where those heuristics came from? Where did they come from? They didn't make them up, right? Testing? Anybody else? So they took something like 400, do you remember, Brad? It's 400 or 500 systems, and they looked at all of the common usability problems that people had already built into 400 or 500 different systems. And they said, basically, these are the common pitfalls, right? So they could build these heuristics and say, look, these 400 systems in the past all made very similar mistakes, and we're going to kind of boil it down and make the big affinity diagram of it and say, here's the 10 things you shouldn't do, right? Most of the people who made usability mistakes used a lot of jargon. Most of the people who made usability mistakes didn't give adequate user feedback. So those became the usability heuristics. And in a way, these are the heuristics for your process, where I can say, look, most of the people that screwed up along that dimension used too small of a user community. So they did involve the users, but they didn't involve all the users. They had like a subject matter expert or a power user or something like that, and they didn't really use the breadth. So they did a part, so basically what I'm saying is, in people who didn't have the greatest projects or didn't have the greatest project plans, here are some common pitfalls. And one is that they used a very small user community. And the other is nobody wrote anything down. They say, oh, we know the users. And I say, oh yeah, tell me about them. And they could. Right? We've met them. We've been with them. We saw them in the field. We did the contextual inquiry. And I say, well, can I see the personas? Or can I see what you wrote down? Or I can see where you documented your goals? And they go, no, we met them in person. And everybody on the project team has met them. But you think, what happens if the project team changes? What happens if you want to reuse that knowledge on another project? So you didn't do any documentation of it, and I saw that a lot. Lack of documentation, they didn't write it down. Over here, we would see, where it says lack of ongoing work, we would see an iteration. Right? They would have made one feedback loop. Or they said, well, we built it up to the point where we had an alpha prototype, and we tested that, and that fed into the beta, and then that one had a couple bugs in it, and we fixed them, and we shipped it. That is not iterative design. One iteration isn't an iteration. Right? So we saw that. It's a lack of ongoing work. And often, it wouldn't start early enough in the process. One of the things a lot of people tend to forget is that you can test the user experience easily with early mock-ups, click-throughs, paper prototypes, all sorts of things like that, long before you have any of the mechanics of the back end and the engineering side of a system working. And that's often not done. Often, people go way too far along into the process until too much of it is working, and now it's too late to go and change, or the changes end up being too costly. So this lack of ongoing work and not starting early enough. And we didn't see a lot of people tracking any kind of metrics, not even some of the easy ones to get to, like satisfaction. Have you guys heard of the SUS? It's the System Usability Scale. It's a 10-question satisfaction survey. It's open source. We see it used a lot. There's a couple other ones out there. But the SUS is kind of nice. You can benchmark it against some other things. And finally down here, I don't know if this is true anywhere. It was certainly true at this client. It's very engineering-heavy teams. You talk to them about interdisciplinary design, and how many of you guys have seen Blues Brothers? Seen the Blues Brothers? That's it. This is very culturally relevant. Anyway, the Blues Brothers are playing in a bar, and they say, we have both kinds of music, country and Western, right? So the punchline is they think that they're being very diverse, but they aren't really. And we've heard people basically say, we have all kinds of experience on this team. And then they go name people, and every single one of them has the word engineer in the title, right? And you want to say, like, where's your user experience expert? Where is your human factors guy? Where is, I mean, not that you have to throw a random filmmaker in there, but do you have graphic design? Do you have industrial design? Where are some of these other skills? And how do you expect to make a usable product if you don't have interdisciplinary design? So let me show you a case study, and hopefully this will be a good example of this. This is one of my favorite projects. I love to show this project and show it as an example. I think, even though now it's maybe 15 years old, I think one of the reasons it stays relevant is because it really does score high. If you think about all of those things, we built a lot of iterations, and I'll show them to you. We had documentation on the users, and I can probably show it to you. That slide I had a long time ago about the system architecture and the user interface architecture, we did work on the information architecture, and it drove us to what we think is a good, well, we know it's a good interaction design because we tested it with users, and we had some of those metrics and some of those data. So this is one of the this is the product. It's an example of what the product looked like when the client came to us. And I'm sure you've heard the term feature creep, but this thing is it's an electric power meter, a little bit like the one that goes on the outside of your house, except this is an industrial one. Typically uses 480 volt power, and it measures 400 or some odd different measurements. Right? It measures the voltage, and it measures the current, and it measures the lowest voltage over the last 24-hour period, and it measures harmonic distortion, and it measures the harmonic distortion of the harmonic distortion. And they just kept adding features because they were in a competitive environment, and anytime they thought the competitor was catching up to them, they'd add features, and anytime the competitor put a feature in that leapfrogged, they'd put that one in there in the next year too. And it got to the point where when you hit these up and down buttons, it was supposed to page through the screens in there. And there used to be at the beginning about 5 or 6 screens. But these little lights would light up as you go from screen to screen to screen. So you'd hit the down arrow, it would go from current to voltage to power and so on, and that area in there would light up. I don't know. Sorry for jumping ahead. Sometimes I have a picture of the documentation for it, and you can just see the density of the information on these screens, and it's terrible. But as they added features, it got to the point where you hit the down arrow, it wouldn't even go from current to voltage. The light wouldn't move from here to here. You'd realize there were 2 screens for current. And then the year after that, there were 3. And then the year after that, and so on. And it was a different number for each of those. So you didn't know what was going to happen when you hit the down arrow. And the documentation was this thick, and it was text screens, just screen after screen after screen after screen. So we did some research. We went out in the field. And one of the really interesting things that happened when we went there was that, I don't know if I can accurately draw this picture, but we were talking to these guys about some of the systems they used and how this meter worked and how they would do it. And they ended up with things where they'd have a dial like this, and we looked at it, and it was mounted crooked. They had another one next to it like this, and this would mounted, kind of crooked the other way, right? So the little needle would kind of come up like that, and this one sort of had the needle, and he would point sort of in a different way. And they had a bunch of these lined up like this, and so we asked them, because we said, you guys seem like pretty smart guys. Why'd you do this? And they said, well, look again. We said, they still look crooked. They said, no, you're not getting it. Look again, right? And what they had done was they'd put a little Sharpie marker up here at the top, like this. And in each of these cases, right, when the plant was running nominally, when it was running well, all the arrows pointed straight up in the air. And the guy said, do you see why we mounted them crooked now? We didn't mount them crooked like you think they're crooked. But when everything's working well, we can stand across the room and we can see all the arrows pointing straight up, right? And they say, then we know everything's going smoothly. And when one of the arrows sort of dips over to the side, right, then we can tell that there's a problem with the plant. So we like these analog dials. We went to the trouble to do this. And that was very interesting, and they said, we've lost all of that capability. We go to these new digital meters, and it's all just words and text and numbers on the screen, and you can't tell any of that. And I can't tell it from across the room, and I have to walk over, and I have to push the buttons and click through. And the novice, when they come in, they can't tell you that a reading of 480 on this one is nominal. But back in the old days, when we used to take these analog things and put them in the wall, what you called the wrong way, and put a little Sharpie marker at the top or something, and they could also do this. They could put a band on it, and they could color this band green and cover these bands yellow, and right? If this is over in the yellow, even a newbie can say, oh, I see where the sort of danger values are, and if it goes out past that, I should probably run. But when you're showing somebody a number and it says 422 on a screen, they had no idea. So you could actually learn from this as well. So we did a lot of things, but one of the things that we did was we tried to work with them to diagram, and we drew this bullseye diagram, where in the center of the diagram we said, back when you were dealing with the analog things and back before all this feature creep happened, what was really important to you? And they listed about 10 or 12 things, not 400, right? we said, okay, what's next after that? Like if you saw a bad value in one of those 10 or 12, what would you look at? And they said, oh, okay, it's these things. So we had a list of sort of the next tier, and we drew them on a bullseye. And one of the reasons we do that is because you can only fit 10 or 12 things in the middle. So when we asked them to prioritize things, it's a little bit like what we were talking about with buy a feature. You know, you're space constrained. So they don't get to jam everything in the middle. They have to sort of put only the important stuff in the center. And then this became one of our navigation maps and one of our nice diagrams here. You can see critical items, 3 screens. So we went from 45 screens or something down to 3 that you see almost all the time with graphics. So now they can say, I mean, this is just an early representation of this, but now the screen that's in there, instead of being text and text and text and text, they can look at one of 3 pictures, and we can make them even auto-rotate through the thing, and now I can see stuff from across the room. And when that triangle starts to bend into a funny shape, because it represents something having to do with the power quality, they can recognize it right away. And then, if you see some problem here and you want to drill down to more information, there's just a couple screens, and these show you more detail from that. And then if you want to look at something like, what happened over the last year? What happened over the last 24 hours? How do I set an alarm? And let me see even more detail. You can come down here even farther. So we had this navigation map early on, but it was also a reminder to us to get these critical items. And it all came from this bullseye diagram we made, which had nothing to do with the user interface, and it had nothing to do with the engineering stuff. It was pure information architecture, like that diagram I showed you before. It was all just about the information space. But having that then, we were able to build it in and bake it into the interface and have the interface make some sense. This notion I told you about the iterative nature of this and building mock-ups early. A little hard to see in this picture, but this is the earliest mock-up. It's a block of wood with a little knob on it, and it's driving a web browser on that PC. And so we started to make some really terrible web-based mock-ups of this user interface. But one of the things we wanted to learn was, can people interact with it with a knob? Our client really wanted to have a pretty simple thing to interact with. And they also had environmental constraints. You couldn't really put a lot of controls on this thing because it was in a dangerous and a hazardous environment. And there was dirt and water intrusion problems. So that's why that last picture I showed you of the real product had that sort of printed plastic panel with those really crappy buttons on it. And the knob, even though it's a little harder because it's something that rotates to stop it from getting dirt intrusion and that kind of things, at least it's only one place. So you get some good seals in there and you can do that. But can I make the interaction a single knob that I rotate back and forth? And so we built this, but we moved on later to one that looked like that black piece of wood, but it had a hole cut in it and we had a monitor behind it and all sorts of crud behind the thing, behind the, like, don't pay attention to the wizard behind the curtain sort of thing. But we could fake and pretend that we were building this user experience, and we had many rounds of usability tests here. To the point where what we learned was, yes, people can interact with it. This, I think, is one of our later prototypes, but you can see a little bit about how these diagrams work out. You can see the readability of the text. One of the things that I loved about this project was the documentation was basically there. You didn't need 50 zillion pages of documentation. That says, turn to select, turn to highlight, push to select, and hold in for help. And that was it. That's all people really needed. And obviously, this is the trick, right? Many, many iterations. But that language was great for most people. And they would turn the knob, and it would move a highlight around the screen. They would push it to select stuff. And if they didn't know what that field was, you just hold it for 2 seconds, and context help would come up. And so that was it. That was all we needed. It took us many rounds of iteration to figure out exactly what the graphics and the language, to get everything down to 3 words and get to fit on there. But again, it's sort of a triumph of the iterative process. Yeah?
For something that may be a little more complex than this, do you kind of always assume that whatever you design, the engineers can figure it out and make it work? Or there's some kind of constraints?
And actually, this is pretty complex. I mean, we make it look simple, and it's a nice case study. But no, this is why we have an engineering staff at Maya. But we're constantly talking to, in this case, our client was going to build the actual thing. But our engineers built the mock-up. We had later on some pretty involved mock-ups that had a simulator in behind it. So the values would actually change while people were doing usability tests. The earlier ones were just click through static screens, that kind of thing. The later ones actually had that simulator in behind it. And it is pretty complex, but remember, this is the beauty is you don't think it's complex because now we've tamed the complexity of it. But we'll use our engineers for that kind of thing, but we'll also use our engineers to talk to our clients, because usually they're the ones with that technical capability, and they're the ones that want to build and manage that process and deploy it and worry about quality assurance and worry about support and everything else. But we'll be in constant contact with them to find out what's possible, what's not possible. And it's another reason you do the iterative design is because you want to find out, like I show you, I don't know if this exactly does it, but I show you early mock-ups of the screen here, right? And you come back and you say, oh, that's not possible because of engineering constraint A or engineering constraint B, right? I go, okay. And that's another thing that we'll often do. We do it a lot when we're coming out of a usability test. But one of the things we'll look at is the impact of any particular design change or any particular feature we have. So over here, were I able to make the knob and the single click interface, or were I able to make that graphic, right? It's going to be over here someplace and have real high impact on my users. So they're all really happy. And over here I have a little bit less impact, right? And then I can also look though at the difficulty, right? So this could be the engineering difficulty, it could be the political difficulty within an organization, it could be because there's laws, a lot of laws and regulations involved with this thing. But there's things that are sort of less difficult and less costly to implement, and things that are much more costly and more difficult to implement. And almost all the time we come out of a usability test or heuristic analysis, we'll plot the things we found on this chart, because as you can imagine, over here is my highest value stuff, right? What everyone calls low-hanging fruit. It's going to give me a lot of impact and a lot of happy users, and it doesn't cost me a lot of money to do it. But what we'll do at Maya often is we'll be the experts along this dimension, and your engineering staff might be the experts along that dimension, right? So I can say, all right, I put them all down here on this axis, and then I'll maybe not even tell you where they are, and I want you to put them all on this axis. And now I can see, well, these are the luxuries, right? They don't have a great impact and they're pretty costly, right? These are your strategic issues, right? It's costly, but I want to get to them. They are going to have a big impact on the users. And these down here they're like user interface bugs. All right, not that great an impact, not that costly either. We can let the interns work on those maybe. The new guy. Well, because they're lower risk too, right? Stuff that's up here, right, and certainly stuff that's over here, it's a higher risk. These are actually, I really want senior folks, smarter people working on these. It's very important to my user satisfaction and the user experience. But it's also, I got to get them right. It could be pretty costly to engineer these things. I want to make sure I do a good job. So yeah, the answer to your question, I think the answer to your question is partly in that chart, and that's partly the reason we have engineers on staff is not because we're always building stuff, but often they're the liaisons to the other engineering team, so they can come back and say, as a user interface designer, hey Dave, you can't build it that way. That's not possible or ridiculously costly. Do you have any other alternatives? And I can lay out my other alternatives. Say, these aren't as good, but, and they say, oh yeah, but that one is really easy to engineer. So you're getting your return on investment calculations done that way. And so the reason I showed you this is so you can see some progression, right? It's some initial sketches moving into some mock-ups we might have made, moving into something that's really sort of an appearance model at this point. I mean, this looks suspiciously like the real product. That's a photograph of the real product. But you can kind of see how you kind of ratchet up the fidelity as you go and how this iterative design process works. Also, when I was showing you those checkups and saying, here are the hallmarks of a good human-centered design project, I might ask for evidence of, if I'm evaluating your project, of that iterative design, and here we have it in this case study. Here's another interesting one. This one covers a lot more dimensions. It's also got some kind of neat prototyping things. So a client came to us and they said, we work on these telepresence rooms. Has anybody seen these things? We work on these telepresence rooms, and Cisco, for example, sells these. And they put high-definition televisions in the back there, and they put chairs in the front and cameras. And it looks like the 6 people in this room are sitting across the table from the 6 people in the other room, which is great if you are doing what we're doing now, maybe, right? Talking to each other. It's a lot of face-to-face stuff. But as soon as someone wants to share a PowerPoint, can you see where the PowerPoint is in this? Right? It's kind of down in the hole, right in the middle of the table. And it's clearly an afterthought in this. And here we are in person, and I can draw on a whiteboard, and you guys can all see the whiteboard. in this telepresence room, right, where's the whiteboard, right? So we can't share anything. I mean, first of all, the walls are painted a very careful color, but even those guys in the chairs on the far side, they could walk behind them maybe and write something on that wall if it were a whiteboard, but I can't really see it. It's kind of over their shoulder. They're obscuring it. It's not really a great way to collaborate. And so we had explored the possibility, and so I showed you, think back to where I showed you that whole big toolkit of all of the techniques we use. This one is much more in the realm of concepts and video concepts and those kind of things. And what we did was we built some future-looking mock-ups of what it might be if I mounted a tablet into the table. And so I have this collaborative sketching environment. So if we want to collaborate face-to-face, I look up and I see all of my fellow meeting people, whatever you're going to call them, right? My fellows, right? All my fellow collaborators, and they're all around the table here. But also, we could sketch. And so it's not up on a wall like that. Maybe it's in front of us, mounted on the table. And this is a hypothesis at this point that this might be an interesting thing to do. Everybody can see it. They should be able to focus their eyes on it. I can give them a pen and they can write on it. We can all sketch on this thing. How might that work? Well, I might need a login screen. Well, you can see with a little bit of foam core and a couple, minutes with some tape and some glue, I can start to, bring in and I can start to animate some of this stuff. And we did a lot of stop motion animation here. This is our mock-up of that telepresence room. It's 5 or 6 of us, 6 I guess in this case, sitting at a couple tables we had at Maya with one of our walls, and then we went and got some collaborators, right? And these guys are just foam core guys. But the point is you can build some really low fidelity prototypes here, even in physical environments. We moved to things that were, this is an IKEA table with a Wacom tablet built into it. So now we're starting to get a little bit farther down the road, and we're not using the paper mock-ups and the foam core things anymore, but we're starting to get into questions like, can I tilt it toward me? Because you want it to be flat so that you can put your coffee cup on it and you can work at that table. And if you don't want to use it, we haven't really changed the table at all. But I also might want to tilt it towards me for privacy or for a better writing angle, or the glare is horrible in some of those rooms because of the way they're lit. So we built this mock-up here, but we went to IKEA and got this table, and we got a Wacom thing and some skateboard wheels underneath it so that it could move back and forth. Here's another example of making some of these mock-ups. A company came to us and they said that baseball scouts, there's a lot of different types of baseball scouts, but the Pirates, when they're playing, will typically have a scout, and the scout is watching whoever we're going to play tomorrow, they're watching their games today. And then they send all the scouting information back, right? This guy's hurt. Their pitcher's pitching about this fast. He seems to like to do this. This is what's going on with that opposing team. So I'm scouting out who I'm going to play with ahead of time. And it's a horrible travel burden that these guys are. It sounds like a lot of fun. You watch a lot of baseball games, but it's really pretty hard work. And what did we do? Well, we went out and we realized through contextual inquiry, technique we all know and love, and we took these photographs of these guys and we learned stuff like it's really hard to work out in the sun and balance everything on your knees. And they have these big hats so they don't get dehydrated. They all have these radar guns. They're constantly carrying batteries and radar guns and stopwatches, and they got them all wrapped around their neck and everything. They're trying to balance, I think I said this already, they're trying to, up in that upper corner, they're trying to balance everything on their legs. And then they have to go back to the hotel and do like 2 hours of drawing these diagrams and data entry and everything and fax it back to the team so the team can see it. And so the question was, could we build something that's a little bit more direct entry, right? So rather than writing it all down and then transcribing it again and then faxing it, maybe we could build something like this, which would be a tablet computer, and we can show what the score is, how fast is the fastball. I can take notes on some of these things, and I can build some of this stuff in, right? Now I don't need the radar gun, and I don't need to, well, I still need the radar gun, but I don't need to transcribe the information. It's right here, right? I don't need to draw the spray chart of where the hits went. I can just mark it with my pen on the thing here. I can mark where the pitch was. That's what's in the upper left then. So we're replicating. This is the interesting thing about contextual inquiry. All this kind of stuff that they were doing by hand and drawing in Illustrator in the evenings and things like that, we were replicating a lot of that stuff. So we had all this data that we got from contextual inquiry, and we could gather all these artifacts, and it helped us in our designs. Now, if you look closely, you'll realize, and this is my point about prototyping and mock-ups, this is not a tablet computer. This is a block of wood with Tylenol at the bottom, I think, right? And so the point is, we don't go and build this thing, really. I mean, it looks like it's a screenshot, but it's not. It's a piece of paper underneath a little plexiglass. And then we could take this to the baseball scouts and get some feedback on this early, while we've risked a block of wood and a color printer, or what, color printout, right? And a little bit of a graphic designer's time. So this is very close after some of that contextual inquiry. And the other reason you might use this is to go and see if you can get funding for something like this. So can we drum up support within this organization to pay for this thing? So I'm using it for usability purposes and getting feedback and trying to do it for iterative design purposes. But a lot of these things that have conceptual aspects to them are so that I can rally my team, so I can get some funding, so I can try to see if Project A is better than Project B, so I go and envision what those things might look like in the future, and then I can compare and contrast them and figure out which one I might want to fund. Yes?
So nowadays, would you have done that like on an iPad with HTML or something?
Probably started with Photoshop mock-up on an iPad and moved to click-throughs, HTML. You usually go from static images to a click-through to something that's more likely to be working and clickable and click-through. So that's pretty typical that we, and yeah, today, because this technology now exists and is obvious and is $400 and I got 50 of them laying around Maya, yeah, I would definitely put that screenshot, which is already, obviously that one's in digital form already. I would put that onto something like an iPad. Right? In fact, it's highly likely that's how they would deploy this product today too, so why not start there, yeah. Now, when I'm but the problem now is the next thing someone's asking me to design is now 5 years out on some platform that doesn't exist yet, right? So now I'm back out with my wooden mock-ups and those kind of things. But yeah, there's a lot of ways. I mean, this is one of the ways the whole industry is changing, right? I'm showing you something that's, 10 or 15 years old, where, in fact, this probably predates the iPad. Right? This is probably when we were thinking you might use an early tablet computer. In fact, you can kind of tell from the stylus, right? Today, even if you were going to draw this picture, you'd probably show finger input. So we have time for one more. So this is, again, this is hopefully a case study that shows you a lot of these good practices at work. So a client came to us and they were building this Dalek. This is the thing on the left. This is the before picture. This kind of, I don't know whether it looks like a Dalek. Anybody know what a Dalek looks like, right? But it's this kind of a scary looking thing. Fairly intimidating. So the challenge here is, has anybody ever used those blood pressure cuffs at the pharmacy, right? You go to pick up your thing and they're counting out your pills and you sit over there and you figure, well, I got 5 minutes to kill and test your blood pressure. The value in those is that it isn't a doctor, obviously. It's a little kiosk. But it does give you kind of early warning, and a lot of people will go see the doctor if that machine gives them an early warning. So it's not really a doctor, it's just a little kiosk, but it can give you enough information that you're far out of the range. But it turns out that most people do get their blood pressure screened, and one of the things they don't do, however, is get their vision screened. And I don't remember exactly what the number is, but you're supposed to get your vision checked every year, but on average it's like every 4 years that people actually go do it. So the question that these guys had was, could you build a screening kiosk that is a lot like the one that does your blood pressure screening, except this is for your eyesight? And it's a bit of a challenge, and the reason it looks so funny is because what's inside there are a whole bunch of mirrors, because that little viewfinder here that you look in, right there, it goes and there's like a 20-foot path inside the thing with a few mirrors, so that when you look in there, you can do the close vision on this screen. This one's not turned on. You can do your close vision on this screen, but the far vision, you got to look through that other viewfinder. And it's a bit of a challenge, as you can imagine, not just from a usability standpoint and user experience standpoint, but from a human factor standpoint too. Like, there's tall people and there's short people, and I don't want to tell you your vision's bad, and really the problem is you're just not tall enough to see in the thing. Or people are standing on their toes, and or they're leaning over or leaning in. So it's a bit of a challenge to get that thing to be at the right height. And for that matter, even for people to know that that's where they're supposed to look. This is a later revision of this, and there's a lot of changes. One is there's a bit more privacy, so you've got the screen on the side. Another is that we can have people seated, and that helps a lot of the height problems. Doesn't solve them all, but it helps that. There's a little bit of privacy on this side too. The other thing is it's not as scary looking, and now it actually looks like a vision screening kiosk, and it's because we painted the eye chart on the side. And then the user interface is a whole bunch better as well. This is, again, a good example of doing some really early, is this one the movie one?
Thanks for coming to participate in this test. What we're going to be testing today is a user interface for a vision screening system that would be in a kiosk in a mall. What I have here is a paper prototype of the interface. What I'd like you to do is imagine you have approached this kiosk at the mall.
So, have you guys built paper prototypes and tested them in this kind of way, right? So, yes, we do this in the real world too. This is our go-to technique here. It's not just something you learn in class. As much as we can, we build early mock-ups and we test them like this, and we have people walk through them, and it helped us a great deal in this vision screening kiosk example. Everybody, cover your eye. Okay, now, don't move. I mean, you can move, but don't take your hand off your eye. Look around. Did everybody cover the same eye? It's like 50-50, right? Right, left, right, left, left, right, left, right. I mean, now, I'm trying to do a vision screening kiosk. Do you think that it might be important for people to cover their proper eye, right? So this is why you do this kind of thing, and I don't know if you'll see it come up in here, but we learned early on in the paper prototyping stage. Imagine if we had put these kiosks out in the world and we had people covering the wrong eye. And people are coming in for their diagnosis to the doctor and said, you know, I was at Walmart and I did this vision screening thing and it says I can't see out of my right eye. And he's like, you got bigger problems. You don't know your right from your left. Okay, now, everybody cover your eye. Right now it's all going to be, I mean, unless you're messing with me, right? Everyone covered the same eye. So the point is we learned how to do that, and we learned through successive iteration and through our design process here. And this is one of the ways we did it. There's a little woman in the corner here with a video, and she actually turns around like that and does it, and it's how we got this thing to be a bit better. All right, I'm going to skip, we're out of time here. I'm going to skip this case study. But anyway, that's, again, I hope in those case examples, case studies, you saw some examples of us using, in various assemblages, all of those different techniques, right? And maybe I didn't show you a heuristic analysis, but there's some contextual inquiry in there, there's some building of personas, there's a lot of iteration, moving from these low fidelity designs to high fidelity designs. Sometimes we leap out into the future and make conceptual stuff so that we can get the project team all on the same page. These are all examples of things we do every day. And then again, you know, I showed you the one slide in the beginning, but hopefully in some of these, not all of them, but like that meter example, you can see how important that information architecture is, like understanding what the information structure is and letting that guide your design as much as, you know, the iterations you're doing and the user feedback. Do you guys have any questions? Yeah?
How do you know when you're done designing?
Well, I know when I'm done designing because I run out of money. And not to be too sort of snippy and silly with the answer, but frankly, I'm in the consulting business. Clients come to us. They probably have a certain project budget, right? I'm only going to get a certain percentage of that. And even if you're in-house design, you're only going to get a certain percentage of it. And so really, you're going to run out of money or time before anything else, right? And so it's really not so much that I know I'm done design. To some extent, I may never be done design. I mean, that vision screening kiosk probably still has some usability problems. The meter, right? I mean, it was good, right? I mean, we had, well, okay, I worked on it, so of course I think it's good. But I mean, I think it was demonstrably good because we had people in usability studies saying, now that's a good meter, or I'd buy that meter, or I like that meter, or when can I buy this one, right? And those are always, you know, wonderful comments to have when you're in a usability test in a mock-up and they want to know, you know, when can I buy this kind of thing. But really the answer is you kind of work backwards the other way. You look at it and say, this project has this amount of time and this budget here. Well, that means it's got to be beta here, it's got to be alpha here. You know, we only have this amount of time. I know I need to do some user research up front. All right, so here's my boundaries here. And really what you do is you say, okay, realistically, how many iterations can I do? How many times can I get back in front of these users? How many times can I iterate this mock-up? And so it's not so much, I mean, it's a little cynical to say, well, you're done when you run out of money. But really, your project plan, you try to get as many iterations as you can in there within the constraints of, I have to spend money to recruit, I have to spend money to compensate people for their time when I run usability tests, you know, and those kinds of things. So really, it's more, what's the big project plan look like and how does that work out? Then I know I'm done with a design, right? Yeah?
not followed the democratized design process and stuck to an individual designer's opinion, or?
Well, I should say no. But I think there are times for reasons of expediency sometimes. And, you know, there's other times too where, I mean, if I only have an opportunity, like let's say that the time constraints are really short. I only have an opportunity to do a little bit. We might do a heuristic analysis, and then I get somebody who's got a lot of experience and known to be a good designer. Maybe they have a history of wins in usability tests. They can make one change, right? But that's maybe all the budget is there for. In fact, an example, we're working for a client right now, and what they're trying to do is win a big contract. So when they write their, there's a request for proposal, and it's a couple $1 million, right? But they have to write a really good proposal, and they have to win that. And in there, they want to have a couple screenshots of what the user interface might look like. Well, you only get like 30 days to answer and write one of these proposals. So that's a really good example where what's going to happen is someone at Maya, right, a user interface designer and probably a visual designer are going to work to draw a fake, conceptual future, but good, right? And we're going to make claims about the usability based on what we know. Like we'll do a usability audit on it maybe around, and we'll be able to point to stuff and say, based on what we know and good principles and so on, this is a good user interface, right? Subject to the fact that when we actually get the work, we want to do iterative design. But you know, there's an example where I think it is appropriate. We cannot, in 30 days, build mock-ups, build prototypes, get user feedback, recruit people, feed it back into the design process. We're going to get like one chance. And you know, only like 1 or 2 conceptual screenshots are going to make their way into the proposal. So there are times when that happens. And usually it's these extreme time and budget constraints and so on. But it's, you know, it's risky, right? I mean, running things and getting them in front of users reduces a lot of the risk because I see people interact with these things and operate them and work through tasks, and I get the actual feedback. I mean, think about this. Any project where you deploy something, it's going to be usability tested. It's just a question of whether you do it or not, right? You're going to ship a product and it's going to be used and it's going to stink, maybe, and you're going to get all sorts of returns and support calls and, you know, complaints and people going to the competitor and so on. So, you know, stuff's going to get usability tested in some fashion. Let's do it during the project before we ship the thing so that it didn't take, we're taking all the risk out. But there are some times, like I said, the constraints are just too much to deal with, and you have to say, all right, I have some experience here. I hope we know what we're doing. And we understand the risk and why we're doing it, because it's got these constraints. Okay. Thanks a lot. Oh, by the way, if you need me, my email is bishop@maya.com, pretty easy one. But feel free to ask any follow-on questions or send stuff to me. Right. Yep, feel free to visit Maya's webpage. Draw mustaches on my little picture there, whatever you're going to do. About the only thing you can't do, unfortunately, you can go read my crazy blog posts, but you can't comment on them. It's tough nuggies. You just have to send me a personal email if you really have an issue. Thanks. All right, thanks.